So, forward by Angela Davis, preface, reading, resistance, acknowledgement. Wow, part one, rage and resistance lessons, political life and theory. Okay, nice. Let's check this out. Let's read the forward. Part one, beginning now. All right. Okay, cool. This is a forward by Angela Davis. Recent debates on the role of the political intellectuals have not always explored the complex process of linking critical intellectual work with collective organizing practices, and consequently do not always reflect an ap- appre- ap- appreciation of the role of political activists. In this pre-vocative collection of essays, these are essays on state violence, Joy James foregrounds the work of racial activists during the decades of the 1980s. As an actor herself in the movement, she examines her approach to political activism is one is one that demands incisive critical analysis, while her intellectual work is deeply formed by questions that insist on radical structural and personal transformation. These essays serve as a powerful reminder to those who uncritically locate radical activism in the 60s and sometimes 70s that the era of Ronald Reagan was not monolithically conservative. James offers us a panoramic view on social movements headquartered in New York during the 80s that addressed local and as well as national and international issues. She moves from anti-racist organizing to solidarity campaigns with movements in Latin America, the Caribbean, South Africa, and the Middle East, which is West Asia, I think. Yeah, her analysis compellingly links multiple forms of state violence, domestic and imperialist, with schmexual violence, focused on the state process that privatized schmexual violence. Such an acknowledgement of the resistance strategies of the 80s, with all their embedded contradictions, is particularly more important in these contemporary times when conservatism has solidified an ideological terrain that renders it more difficult than ever to deploy radical strategies of resistance. At a time when we need to move beyond black white paradigms of race relations, beyond masculinist approach of anti-racist activism, and when histories of political activism in the 80s should point the way towards complex and multiple understandings of racism and anti-racist activism. Racism is narrowly represented as a historical segregation. This page was left blank on purpose. Preface. I think this is Reading Resistance. Written from 1989 to 1995, resisting state violence, radicalism, gender, and race in U.S. culture, theorized contemporary politics and activism. Its 4 parts examine political theory and language, domestic and foreign policies, culture, and education. Part 1, Rage and Resistance Lessons, Political Life and Theory, contains 3 essays. The introduction, which describes my use of the term radicalism, state, and state violence, provides a brief ethnographic autobiographical I can't say it. Autobiographical, I can't say it. Accounts of political life and lessons among New York City. Among New York City. Among New York City. Oh my gosh. Focal. I'm gonna look this word up, and I'll let you guys know what it means. I'll be right back. Foucauldian, and it means Foucauldian. It doesn't mean Foucauldian. I don't mean that. So Foucauldian, relating to a characteristic of a French philosopher, Michel Foucault, or his ideas. Okay. Interesting. Are you guys excited? Sounds like you guys are excited about this book. All right, let's get back to it. Foucauldian theories of punishment deflect from the prevalence of racist violence in U.S. policies and progressive resistance of such violence. This critique of historical lynching and contemporary policing and death penalties politics trace the trajectory of U.S. political life and radicalized violence. Chapter 2, Radicalizing Language and Law, G-Side, Discrimination and Human Rights, examines language of human rights conventions and relations to U.S. policies, arguing that conventional, quote, race language creates another form of erasure by conceptually serving state racism from G-Side violence. Part 2, Colonial Hangovers, U.S. Policies at Home and Abroad, beginning with Chapter 3, Hunting, Prey, U.S. Invasion of Panama, a critique of the December 1989 booming of Panama as part of an anti-Sprug war. Another American nation with which the United States has had volatile relationships is a topic of the following chapter. Quote, the colors, I don't know if I can say that. I think it's people of color and eros. I don't know, what is EROS? Does anybody know what EROS is? And Cuban as American obsession. I'm going to find out what EROS is. What's EROS? EROS. Yes, that. And I think the other word I used was not a good word to use either, because it has, the reason why I didn't say, it says COLORS, but I don't know if we're referring to people. That's my problem. Dealing with schmexmal, desires. Okay, thank you. Cuban and American obsession, end quote. Chapter 4, Contrast, State Department and conservative depictions of Cuban with free trade advocates, progressive activists, and Havana intellectuals. Perspectives on contemporary Cuban society and political, ethnic, and national identities, including Part 2, quote, border crossing alliances, Japanese and African American women in the state's household, end quote. Chapter 5 speculates on the potential of progressive coalitions of women of color to cross ethnic and class divisions and to confront state colonization of women. Ooh. Dehumanizing representation, normalize and rationalize violence in foreign policy. It is important to examine how such representation in national culture pathologize, quote, blackness and sexuality to portray those most vulnerable to violence as its carriers. Part 3, Cultural Politics, Black Women and Sexual Violence, end quote. Explores sensationalist depictions of sexual violence and black women. Chapter 6, Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas, and Gender Abstraction, examines schmexual politics in 1991 Clarence Thomas confirmation hearing. Quote, symbolic rage, prosecutorial performance, and radicalism representation of schmexual violence. Chapter 7 recounts a family tragedy of domestic and schmexual violence assumed by the state, ritualized punishment, the ways in which radical politics and state persecution shape women's coalition on the interracial grape cases is the subject of Chapter 8, Coalitions Crossfire, Anti-Violence Organizing and Interracial Grape, quote, unquote, which focuses on women's organizing around the 1989 Central Park grape case. The final part, Teaching Community and Political Activism, and analyze progressive, anti-racist, and anti-sexist racist and anti-sexist investigating the noble literature's views on Africanism and ancestors and the role of community and anti-racist American intellectualism. Quote, teaching intersections and the integration of multiculturalism, end quote. Chapter 10 advocates an integrative analysis for more comprehensive critical paradigms and pedagogies of education. We're going to look up pedagogies so everybody can understand what pedagogies are. There's a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Pablo Freire. Very hard technical book. Anyways, here we go. All right, pedagogy. They say pedagogy. So we did the another word, but it's still the same. Hold on a second. Effects. All right. The method of practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical concept. There you go. Oh, wait, go back. Effects. Back to this. This is going to be interesting. I think I'm going to like this so far. Divine desires. In education, chapter 11, gender, race, and radicalism, reading the autobiographies of Native and African American women activists, discussing pedagogy in a comparative study of the life narratives and movement, women confronting state oppression in contemporary students, comparative study of the life narratives and movement, women confronting state oppression in contemporary students, reflecting in their relationship to liberation and politics. The conclusion, United Nations Convention on Anti-Racist Feminisms and Coalition Politics. Consider politics formation and organizing that emphasizes human rights, activism, and covenants. It argues for multiracial international coalitions based on human rights conventions as indispensable for strategic progressive intervention against repression and violence. Acknowledgement. All the acknowledgement is going to acknowledge people, so let's move on. This book was okay. It looks like one. It says one. Rage and Resistance Lessons. Political Life and Theory. Let's begin. This page was left blank. Introduction. In his work, in theory, Aziz Ahmed contends that, quote, debates about culture and literature on the left no longer presume a labor movement as the ground of which we arise. Theory is now seen as a conversation among academic professionals. Indeed, academic debates about culture and politics appear frequently to serve discussions of ethnicity and race, gender, class, and sexuality from the national ethnic women's workers and gay liberation movements. Of course, the academy where self-text preoccupations of individualism may marginalize or psychologize these political struggles. Conversations de-radicalizes as it inbraids, while the intellectual interrogators takes precedent over the activist intellectual. People who resist impoverishment and violence at times seem discouraged by elite academics discourse. The low threshold of political courage it inspires, as well as its truncated version, moving beyond introspection and retrogression of text about violence into conversation with highlights confrontational challenges to violence. We require emphasizing the works of peace and justice activists. More than academic texts, the narratives of an analysis offered here are influenced by New York activists, among whom I counted counted myself, who in the 1980s organized around challenging racism and sexism in U.S. domestic and foreign policies. Rather than being self or text referential and autobiographical political experiences woven into this writing point to a critical thought of radical organization who differentiate between critique of and confrontation with state violence and who were unsatisfied until the former had moved closer to the latter. Some postmodern culture critics are wont to redefine interrogation. Wait, is that let me look this word up. I want to make sure I'm saying it right. As a form of political activism. Yet even these, quote, left or, quote, post-left intellectuals often seem constrained by elite theories that are ill-informed about the concrete political battles outside the congressional civility. This book departs from such positioning. First, it occurs that Barbara Christian's assertion that theory, not rooted in communal practice, is elitist. Second, it contends that political and ethical theory that is oblivious to the specificity of people's struggle for dignified existence free of violence, poverty, and domination shows a myopic insularity. Oh my gosh, another word. Let me make sure this. So that means, oh my gosh, why did I do that? Come on, effects. Insularity means ignorance or a lack of interest in cultures, ideas, or peoples outside one's own experience. I have a feeling we're going to be doing this a lot. All right. Rather than universality. Ooh, resisting state violence rejects the projection of detached thinking as subversive, a projection that obscures the conservative tendency of elitist theory as well as its creativity, plasticity in masking acquiescence to hierarchies. Rather, this book theorizes, quote unquote, to use Christian's verb, the conditions of the most vulnerable to state violence, centering its discussions on radical interventions in U.S. policy, culture, classroom instructions, contending that political and ethical reflections on the policies and activism restructuring American life dictate a writing unrestricted by the discourse of elitism. Locates resistance in political acts, responsive and responsible to political crises, on the basis of a specificity of U.S. struggle, questioning the limitation of U.S. democracy. This work theorizes the possibilities of expanding democratic practices by curtailing state abuses, particularly the radicalized and sexualized manifestation of violence that victimizes, quote, people of color, black people, women, and the poor, to emphasize the ways in which individuals and groups in political coalitions and classrooms instructions counter state violence. I highlight the work of radicals, consequently voting patterns, electoral politics, and lobbying politics and lobbying, and that this political phenomenon, have been studied intensively and abundantly elsewhere, including their shifting importance to the majority of U.S. citizens. Most Americans, with the exception of the Christian right, fail to vote for lobby consistently. What are rarely reported are political expressions from the margins concerning U.S. policies and the state violence embedded in those policies. American politics discourse marginalized critical reviews of radical resistance and state violence. Given the pervasiveness of conservatives and liberal ideologies, we rarely consider the democratic means of objectives of radicalism confronting systematic oppression and promoting economic, radical, and sexual justice. In addition, the oxymoron, quote, radical right, end quote, obscures the interests of neoconservatives and reactionaries have in state dominance, which is exercised through economic exploitation, police violence, prison executions, military bombing, and covert wars, authorized or sanctioned by the U.S. government, its agencies, and constituents of state hegemony, such as the mainstream media. State violence and coercion remain invisible to most Americans. Socialist Ralph Miliband's critique of democracy in advanced capitalist societies offers a useful tool for the discussion of state violence. According to Miliband, people in nations such as the United States, quote, live in the shadow of the state, as political actors attempt to influence or represent, quote, the state's power and purpose, end quote. In order to obtain this sanction and support, one, we can add that activists also attempt to subvert state practices. Radicals challenge its conservative measures while reactionaries determine its liberal reforms. Despite the state power, its abilities to reward, and its willingness to penalize radical actors, the state, quote, as a subject of political study, end quote. As Miliband observed, quote, has long been very unfashionable, end quote. One, those who engage in this unfashionable work also study radical and sexual violence to a deepening actors, the state, quote, as a subject of political study, end quote. As Miliband observed, quote, has long been very unfashionable, end quote. One, those who engage in this unfashionable work also study radical and sexual violence to a deepening their critical perceptives on coercive state politics, developing a unifying theory of the state. The most relevant thinkers address economic, radical, racial, and sexual repression in the culture marked by increasing polarization of wealth and poverty, privilege and disenfranchisement. Examining power and domination within the U.S. government, culture, and civil society, resisting state violence describes and analyze struggle against and disenfranchisement. Examining power and domination within the U.S. government, culture, and civil society, resisting state violence describes and analyze struggle against dehumanizing policies, referring to Miliband's language about the state system. I investigate repressive elements of the state apparatus, including governments, military and police, judiciary, administrative bureaucracy. I explore how the state is racialized and racialized policies and populations to police present repressive elements of the state apparatus, including governments, military and police, judiciary, administrative bureaucracy. I explore how the state is racialized and racialized policies and populations to police violence based on nationality, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and class. Although Malibans distinguishes the state system from to further state hegemony, in spite of their autonomy from the state apparatus, examining repressive U.S. foreign and domestic policies as well as anti-violent resistance with work focused on anti-racist and feminist praxis. This argument and understanding are, of course, like those of every other writer, filtered through the subjective lens of my own political experiences. Unlike the work of every other writer, however, this book is influenced by radical activism that led me to align with progressive measures, political life and stories. During the 1980s, while pursuing a graduate degree in political philosophy from the conservative Jesuit institution, I lived and worked in an international city. International city, with experiences gained off campus. I supplemented my academic education with lessons of progressive radicalism, the most difficult non-academic instructions. Supplemented my academic education with lessons of progressive radicalism, the most difficult non-academic instructions, the hardest to learn yet easiest once learned. To remember where the political lessons about violence destroying or crippling individuals and communities. Cities such as New York can teach a lot about violence, providing information and insights on both violence and resistance. Cities such as New York can teach a lot about violence, providing information and insights on both violence and resistance that are usually denied or restricted in other parts of the United States. An example is late-night alternative radio such as Pacifica Station, W. An example is late-night alternative radio such as Pacifica Station, WBAI, which introduced its listener to Joanna Grant's work on civil rights leader Ella Baker, Christopher Simpson, reaching into U.S. recruitment and employment of Yazidis after World War II, the ex-CIA agent John Stockwell's disclosure of CIA-directed unaliving squads and Contras in Latin America and South Africa, free for donation only forums in community centers and schools enabled attendees to hear representatives from Palestinian women's groups. Community centers and schools enabled attendees to hear representatives from Palestinian women's groups, as well as Noam Chomsky's critique of fascism, state terrorism, the Israel proxy state relationship with the U.S. government in the of fascism, state terrorism, the Israel proxy state relationship with the U.S. government in the Middle East. Other gatherings allowed interaction with women and activists from Nicaragua and El Salvador. During the height of the U.S.-funded Contra War of Nicaragua and in Salvadorian governments used a paramilitary unaliving squads through the organizing of groups such as Madri and Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPES. Concerned U.S. Americans could meet and speak with those directly suffering from the surviving violent repression, obtaining information on Latin American organizations, as well as Nubian, obtaining information on Latin American organizations, as well as Nubian, Namibian independence movement through the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, the African National Congress, ANC, or the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. All labeled, quote, terrorists. Organizations took place in schools, religious houses, and union halls. American Trade Union played a pivotal role in supporting the coalition of South African trade unions during the apartheid regime. The sanctuary movement harbored Salvadorians escaping death squads during the Reagan administration. Progressive churches whose work is largely overshadowed in the media today by an ascendancy of conservatism, fundamentalism, and the Christian coalition were educational and political sites. For instance, more than a few of Brooklyn churches proved to be houses of radicalism. Park Slope United Methodist Church turned into a pulpit over the Nicaraguan president Daniel Ortega. One Sunday in 1987, several miles away on Brooklyn's downtown Atlantic Avenue, the Pentecostal House of the Lord Church held SISSA, Sisters in Solidarity with the Sisters of South Africa, meetings. Members of the Pentecostal congregation were also prominent in city demonstrations and acts of civil disobedience, protest killings in New York Howard Bench and Bensonhurst neighborhoods. Resistance against state violence and control based on community or political organizing was not only expressed without contradictions, embodying other forms of violence and debasement. For example, the conflict that erupted in the late 1980s in response to racial attacks on black males in Howard Bench and Bensonhurst both inspired the alienated potential activists. Perhaps the apex of ideal politics, political organizing and coalition building occur in the multiracial demonstrations of tens of thousands who gathered at downtown City Hall, a Gracie Mason during the administration of Mayor Edward Koch, in response to Howard Bench beating of several black men and the unaliving of black male youth. Some argue that Koch's role in racially polarizing the city, one sharply frayed by racist attacks in the mid to late 1980s, helped to lead to the election of New York City's first African American mayor, David Dinkins. The chant and Gibbs, quote, "Whose streets? Our streets," and "No justice, no peace," hurled at police during later street demonstrations, which the NYPD could not always contain, spoke to the resistance embodied in the, quote, in which radical anti-racists called for a general strike to shut down New York City and paralyze Wall Street, the International Financial District. The global strike never sufficiently materialized. In participating in days of outrage demonstrations, one realized that the march security guards, despite their macho posturing, at times could not protect individuals from police on horseback who rode on sidewalks in fashionable East Side Manhattan across from the UN to break up peaceful protests. Nor could security members guard against other forms of violence from provocateurs within the demonstration or march. When police began to club peaceful demonstrators attempting to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge during evening rush hour, this obstruction would have had an immense impact, drawing a considerable number of New Yorkers into the contestation over racial equality and safety. Demonstrators fought back. Their response were markedly different from those of protesters beaten when Martin Luther King Jr. tried to lead a peaceful march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. These unarmed, mostly male marchers at the head of the demonstrators prepared their self-defense with calls of, quote, women and children to the rear. African American women on and near the bridge argued that they could protect themselves. Exactly. And were in no need of such instructions from the male demonstrators. Damn straight. Fucking men keep on trying to think that they have to protect women. Still, the issue of safety for those engaged in political dissent erupted in other aspects of the Brooklyn Bridge demonstration. During the march to the bridge, a small group of African American male youth menaced male and female protesters, especially female and white marchers, with driving irons. Oh my god, I gotta do a thing now. Did it work? It worked. Driving irons. Some saw this harassment and anti-racist demonstrators as typifying the violence and alienated young black males. Others maintaining that it was unlikely that the youths were members of golf clubs, saw them as provocateurs paid by NYPD renegade or rogue cops to destabilize the march. How one read the roles and relationship of provocateurs, police, and protesters shape one consciousness about the riskiness of political struggles and the violent arrayed against radical progressives. The coverage of the confrontation at the bridge by local television news and most media commentaries did not put these issues in sharp relief or raise ethical questions about how one responds to racist violence, self-defense, and policing to maintain, quote, law and order. With Noam Chomsky and Edward Herm's work on manufactured consent, or with common sense and life experiences in mind, progressive and considered most media sources not fully reliable on their coverage of racism and anti-racism radicalism. Participation in organized efforts and demonstrations, as well as cities distributing volumes of diverse, conflicting information, however, encouraged new forms of literacy, enabled one to read between the lines. This political literacy meant that engaging readers would often survey the New York Times coverage of the days of outrage or protest over South Africa or Cuba, and then discuss the work with the organizers around these issues. Such readers routinely travel in the evening or on weekends uptown to Harlem, Harriet Tubman Public Schools. Such journeys repoliticized Duke Ellington directions to, quote, take the A train, end quote, so that local activists would dialogue with representatives of the nation debating the levels of repression and resistance in their countries. The contempt some black women activists expressed for the political speeches of those who, quote, only knew what they read in books, end quote, galvanized me to become more than an informed, sophisticated spectator. All my political lessons, even my disagreements and clashes with political organizers, political repression, women of racial and economic equality, Madrid, MADRE, Brooklyn Women's Martial Arts, and Black Women's Health Project, the December 12th movement's Days of Outrage, and the many groups doing solidarity and support working with liberation movements in South Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Palestine. Sometimes I focus on the work with a transitory attention of a dilettante. We're gonna find out what the word means. Right back, everybody. I tried. Is dilettante. Very, very, very technical. A person who cultivates an area of interest, such as art, without commitment or knowledge. Dilettante. Huh. I'll probably forget what the word means again. This is how it works in this. Sometimes with the staying power of the marathon runner. Most radical activists read passionately on the run while organizing and attending political and educational forums and demonstrations or lobbying for legislation. Waiting for subways, buses, planes, speakers, or cultural workers provided time for reflection, sometimes relentless in intensity and pervasiveness of violence of governmental policies led to simplistic readings as well as extreme bitterness and isolation. Yet in general, the radicals I knew transmitted not only political intelligence, but also intense feelings, sometimes bigoted and chauvinistic, most times loving and with enormous intelligence and commitment. Let me make sure this was it. They knew transmitted not only political intelligence, but also intense feelings, sometimes. Okay. That intelligence allowed them to understand contradictions and work for coalitions, exhibiting a political acumen, often unacknowledged in most mainstream media or academic representation of street radicalism. The intimacy of the political work, particularly work struggling towards saving lives and grieving deaths, meant that one study nearly every moment. People, quote, read while marching, standing, or praying at the memorials in the mid-1980s for women leaders such as ANC Representative Dulcie September, who was assassinated by South African paramilitary attaches in Belgium, or for Nicaraguan Sandinista UN Representative Norin Astorga, who died from cancer, or at rallies celebrated Such work meant hours of traveling and watching. Reading often entailed complex contradictions in sites where there were no simple lessons. Hundreds standing in black Brooklyn streets, in the interracial overflow of mourners at Yusuf Hawkins' funeral service following the Bensonhurst, quote, lynching. Listened while the church's outdoor speaker piped Nation of Islam minister Louis Farrakhan's eulogy, whose gentle calls for peace and brotherhood mocked his reputation as fiery, hatred-filled oratory. Where we at? All right, hopefully this will be it. Economic violence and political conservatism. The June 1995 Supreme Court ruling that Connecticut need to provide for its indignance reflects the, quote, new federalism, as well as the moral and state positioning of the previous and current decades that is marked by punitive discourse and rationalized indifference to the need of the poor. A decade before the new federalism had caught on, Reaganites politicians authorized a Human Welfare of Social Service Administration to list ketchup as a vegetable in order to cut food assistance to poor mothers on aid to families with dependent children, AFDC. These same politicians offered on aid to families with dependent children, AFDC. These same politicians offered the term benign neglect, a term coined by Democratic Senator Daniel Moynihan earlier years, to explain how these policies left an estimated 30 Moynihan earlier years, to explain how these policies left an estimated 33 million people living below the poverty line, millions more on the broader line, and 1 million homeless during the 1980s. From the 1979 to 84, the percentage of families headed by single women lived below the poverty line, set then at 10,609 for the family of four, increased from 34.9% to 83.4%, with 5 million additional women pushed into poverty. Demographics showed that 27.9% of the household headed by European American women, 52.9% of those headed by African American women, and 53.2% of those households led by Latinas and Chicanas were impoverished. The advocacy group for poor people, Bread for the World, reported in its 1980s publication that 2 out of 3 adults in poverty were women, with women of color twice as likely to be poor than white women. 44.9% of African children and African American children, compared to 14.7% of white children, lived in poverty. Such economic and physical violence, African American infants were twice as likely to die in their first year than Euro-American infants. Black male teenagers are 6 times as likely to be murdered than their white counterparts, becoming defined in the 1980s through the administration's pronouncements of houseless people, quoting, wanted, end quote, to live on the streets, that the poor were, quote, lazy. And I know that's not true, but for emphasis and for clarification, I said that because that's what they said. Welfare cheats, and that black people were violence prone, as indicative of the deficiency of deviance of the poor and people of color, not of the state, its laws, and its lack of implementation of human rights covenants. In the past 15 years, the meteoric ascendancies of ultra-conservatives in academia, the media, and the government indicates severe shift in the U.S. political climate since the 1980 election. Whether the shift have been cataclysmic or mere fluctuations depends on how one gauges the stature of ultra-conservatism intellectuals, such as those housed at the think tank of Heritage Foundation, considered in the earlier 1980s at the think tank of Heritage Foundation, considered in the earlier 1980s to be on the right-wing fringe and the polemical site influential only among neoconservatives of Ronald Reagan's administration. By 1994, the Heritage Foundation had become the designated neoconservatives of Ronald Reagan's administration. By 1994, the Heritage Foundation had become the designated site of that year's freshman orientation for the newly Republican dominated of that year's freshman orientation for the newly Republican dominated Congress, replacing the historical site of bipartisan orientation of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Congress, replacing the historical site of bipartisan orientation of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, which was considered too liberal and democratic. The Heritage Foundation, all the while School of Government, which was considered too liberal and democratic. The Heritage Foundation, all the while reassuring the public that its orientation was bipartisan, chose as its keynote, all the while reassuring the public that its orientation was bipartisan, chose as its keynote speaker, rightist talk show pundit Rush Limbaugh. What the fuck? We're not right. We're bipartisan, but Rush Limbaugh. The fuck? All right, let's hopefully get them. When in November 1994 elections created the first Republican-dominated Senate and House of Representatives since 1952, the Republicans sweep, including the rhetoric of the Populist Pact, at alleged contract to discipline, if not criminalized, immigrants, poor people, black people, gay people, and lesbian people, and those advocating reproductive rights. The changing political climate has been accompanied by skirmishes of language and imagery. The conservative contract with America has been renamed by its opponents as the Contract on America. Liberal-minded critics refer to the prison growth industry and punitive policies for the poor as, quote, driving up by politics, end quote. Conservatives dismiss liberal intellectuals and artists as an immoral quote counterculture. Language can be used either to evoke or efface the deteriorating material conditions within the United States. For example, in New York City, the number of emergency food providers rose from 50 in 1980 to more than 8,800 in 1994. And in November 1994, Mayor Randolph Giuliani, I hate him, during the impending Thanksgiving holiday season, admonished churches and private agencies to do more about devastating hunger and malnutrition in the city, combining chastisement with a performance. The mayor donated 2 cans of powdered baby formula to kick off the Daily News food drive while cutting emergency food assistance funds by hundreds of thousands of dollars. In the preceding decades, despite their diminishing material conditions, many white people, particularly males, voted for candidates who passed policies and legislations benefiting the top 5% of the U.S. population. From the 1980s to 1990, as documented by the U.S. House Ways and Means committees, U.S. House Ways and Means committees, tax progressivity, I can't say a damn word. Progressivity, I can't say a damn word. Progressivity, I can't say it. The income distribution report on March 26, 1990, the pre-tax income for those in the poorest first decile fell from $5,128 to $4,600. The poorest first decile fell from $5,128 to $4,695, for a loss of 8.4%, while raising 3.3% in the fifth decile. the lower middle or working class from 32,674 to 33,760. The 10th decile gained the most, 37.1%. Its economic rose from 105,611 to 144,832. The wealthiest 5% pre-tax income increased from 142,133 to 2,600,000 and $162. Those are all dollars. From the ultra rich, incomes ballooned by 75.5% from 312,816 to 548,000 to 969. When these desperate incomes were average, everyone seemed to gain 15.5% of their income during the previous decade. Within a week of the House Ways and Means report, the New York Times reported on March 29, 1990, that economic gains from 1980 to 1989 were tied to poverty and higher corporate profits. Personal saving rates of the net national income declined 8.9% to 3.6%. Average hourly wage decreased from 9.84% to 9.66%, while the percentage of U.S. population working rose 59.6% to 63.3%. American families of the needing to work harder to stay even predictably leads to retrogressive radical racial and gender politics. Traditionally, for historically privileged sectors in the United States, increased income stratification and impoverishment signaled a backlash against racial, sexual, and economic progressivism, eroding standards of living. From 1989 to 1993, the average U.S. household annual income fell 7% for a loss of $2,344, promoting scapegoats as an outlet for the deflection from declining economic conditions among the worst voters. The racialized and sexualized scapegoat deflection from declining economic conditions among the worst voters. The racialized and sexualized scapegoating and resentment are convinced even among the supposedly enlightened classes. In theory, college-educated middle-class voters were less susceptible to racist demagoguery. In practice, however, this is not always the case. For example, the majority of votes for neo-Yahtzee Davy Duke in his 1992 Louisiana gubernatorial bid. I have no idea what this word is. Let me go look it up. We're getting to the point. Sorry, everybody. Gubernatorial bid. I have no idea what this word is. Let me go look it up. We're getting to the point. Sorry, everybody. We're getting to the point. Sorry, everybody. Gubernatorial. I can't say it. Here we go. All right. Relating to state governor or official of state governor. Okay. Fair enough. Bid came from middle class, not poor, whites. Let's see how long I have for this. 26. Hold on. Okay, 26. I can make it down to there. All right, let's see how far we get in this. Playing the race card or electoral war games. Racialized resentment and fears have also proved politically useful. In his heyday, the late Republican strategist Lee Atwater managed George. In his heyday, the late Republican strategist Lee Atwater managed George Bush's 1988 presidential campaign, and observers argued secured the presidential victory by, quote, playing the race card, end quote, through the Willie Horton ad campaign. Atwater informed the Republican Party that the, quote, class struggle in the South continues, with the white populace serving as a trump card, and the populace inclined towards economic liberalism but social conservatism. Quote, when Republicans are successful in getting certain social issues to the forefront, the populist vote is ours, end quote. These, quote, certain social issues focused on criminal violence represented by the black male and welfare abuser representatives by black females. So that's what they're saying that they did. Not like she's saying that. That's what they're doing. To prove this argument that white people would vote in the basis of social rather than economic issues, Atwater with Roger Ailes promoted the Willie Horton ad, which constructed Bush's Democratic opponent, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. Democratic opponent, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, I can't say his name, as, quote, soft on crime. Specifically, in the U.S. lexicon, as soft on the most heinous crimes, namely blackmail, sexual assaults against white females. Ugh. Where criminality is also constructed around deviant, quote unquote. Sexuality appeals to race prove effective in politics. For example, Bush-Horton tactics to encourage white people to prioritize social over economic interests was recycled in 1992 by both David Duke's, gubernatorial and Patrick Buchanan's presidential primacy race. Marlon Riggs described Buchanan's use of Riggs' documentary on African American gay men, Tongues United, as an, quote, ironic reversal of a smear tactic against George Bush himself, end quote. Buchanan's controversial campaign ad provided politics with, quote, a new cast of characters to demonize, then scapegoat. The specter of Willie Horton has turned, but this time, at least in Mr. Buchanan's distorted views, he is a leather-clad, bare-chested, sadomasochist, homosexual dancing shameless in the street. North Carolina Republican Senator Jesse Helms turned federal funding from Tongues United into the Willie Horton issue of National Endowment for the Arts, according to Riggs, who argues that it was not only federal funding for cultural work on gay sexuality that was protested, but funding for work by the old gay black person men as well. Racists, as well as homophobic violence and rhetoric, were on the rise. In November 1994, Helms designated not yet acting chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee told the Realm News and observers that the president was so unpopular that military base personnel in North Carolina that, quote, Mr. Clinton had better watch out if he comes down here. He better have a bodyguard, end quote. The senator, who was never censored for his enthusiastic allusions to the presidential assassination, was partly inspired by Clinton's, albeit waffling support for the rights of gay people and lesbian people in the military. The increase in hate violence monitored in 1994, homophobic and or racist and anti-Semitic beatings and unalivings, as well as abortion clinics, shootings, and executions, conceivably reflected the rise in hate speech and speech advocating violence. Helms included that marked the emergence of a rise in hate speech and speech advocating violence. Helms included that marked the emergence of a new national government. Despite the rather clearly communication intent of extreme right politics and news commentators insist that there is little connection between hate speech and murder. Critics have also argued that U.S. citizens are inherently better off than Canadians and Czechoslovakian people, for example, who are restrained by national anti-hate speech legislations. Arguments with disavowed correlations between hate speech and hate crimes exempt state representatives and the media from responsibility from violence that is, in fact, patterned after their rhetoric. There is growing... Hold on. Rhetoric. There is growing... Hold on. Do. Okay, back to it. There is a growing cynicism within the mainstream culture about the use of racist rhetoric and stereotypes to fuel white It's suburbanites, people that live in the suburbs, suburbanites. What the hell? Oh well, good enough. While the majority of the white assault and rape victims are attacked by other white people, still the national icons for welfare cheat, rapists, thief, and murderers as black encouraged the acceptance of state violence as state protection. Racialized narratives constructed around crime, declining national intelligence, and white victimization by affirmative action instigated by, I can't say this, aggressors. They're saying like people that are not white aggressors. In short, the violent, intellectual, unqualified, and morally corrupt who usurp the rights of the law-abiding moral and intellectual and morally corrupt who usurp the rights of the law-abiding moral and intellectual competent would be more assuming if such myth-making were not so widely embraced. Boston Globe columnist Derek Z. Jackson notes that although violent crime is at a record 20-year low, and although its most likely victims at a record 20-year low, and although its most likely victims are African American teenagers, and the white public perceives itself as besieged are African American teenagers, and the white public perceives itself as besieged by black criminals. Quote, in its blazing orange Schmurdered edition, Newsweek graphics departments, not to be outdone by Time's blackening of O.J. Simpson's mugshot, displayed a number of homicides of African American liberation people of color. Oh my gosh, that was hard. In the U.S., visual American liberation people of color. Oh my gosh, that was hard. In the U.S., visual culture representation render social violence, particularly sexual violence, as synonymous with blackness. That's wild. Such images in turn legitimize state violence. For instance, a, quote, war against crime or a war against drugs as necessary. The catch is violence. For instance, a, quote, war against crime or a war against drugs as necessary. The catch is that these racialized depictions of violence promote racialized responses. In the war on crime, for example, the criminal is embodied in the black. Yeah. They're talking about how the state utilizes the criminality. They're talking about how the state utilizes the criminality of black people, saying that they're the reasons why all this shit is happening, by negating the fact that these are done by white people towards black people. Black people saying that they're the reasons why all this shit is happening, by negating the fact that these are done by white people towards black people. So yeah, they're negating all that stuff. That was a hard section. Next section will be sanctioned violence. Hopefully this lets me like do my thing. Hey! Next section will be sanctioned violence. Sorry if that was a hard read, everybody. I apologize for that. Add a bookmark. I'm gonna add a bookmark. Stopped on page 29. And I apologize if like any of the things I said that I wasn't supposed to say. I'm open for critiques and stuff like that, but I tried my best. It's very hard because they were talking specifically how like the state and all these people blame black people, and they were going through what they said about black people and stuff like that, and how like the state and all these people blame black people, and they were going through what they said about black people and stuff like that, and how they're the real reasons why crime is high during these time periods and stuff like that, and how they are considered the scapegoat is high during these time periods and stuff like that, and how they are considered the scapegoats of what really is going on and stuff like that, like welfare queen that they talked about, which is based in racist tropes because it's particularly against people of color. So hold on a second. Ooh, I'm about to close it out here soon. Does anybody want to come up and talk? I know that was a hard one to do. Not a lot of people stayed, but that's okay. Sanctioning violence. This is just a freaking introduction too. This is not even in the book. It's introductions. This is just a freaking introduction too. This is not even in the book. This introduction's long. Oh my God. Okay, conclusion. Yeah, this introduction. Okay, so it would be 1, erasing the spectacle. Yeah, this introduction. Okay. So it would be 1, erasing the spectacle of racialized state violence, or is it radicalized? No, it's racial. So I got a Wikipedia. No, I don't know. Maybe this is not them. Hold on a second. Let me see. We'll read it together. I'm gonna go off of this thing real quick. What are we doing? How are we doing this? Let's think. Oh yeah. No, no, no. No, no, wrong one. Okay, now I remember. No, yeah, there we go. And let's go back to this. All right. Born in 1958, an American political philosopher, academic, and author, James is a French professor in humanities. Book includes Transcending the New Abolition, Resisting. Huh. Interesting. Let me go back and find more of that Wikipedia. Right back. All right. All it says is that they worked hand in hand with Angela Davis, which is based, which is good, which is good, which is good. She probably takes on the Black radical tradition for sure, and that's something that Maoists should also, as Maoists, we should investigate and know what the Black radical tradition is, and to support Black radical traditions. So that's important as a Maoist, because we believe, because late in the southern region, we believe in New Africa and New African self-determination. So let's see here, effects. So yeah, what are people's thoughts on the book so far? It's just a thing. What is everybody's thoughts so far? Yep, that is. Thank you. So what does everybody think so far about the book so far? Just the introduction. Very interesting. Can't wait to dive into it. Yeah. Okay. Nice. Nice. So this is a bit of a feminist book. It's a bit of a multi issued book. It seems like it's going to hit on feminism too, which is amazing. So it looks like it's going to hit the intersectionalities, which I need more of, honestly. Yeah, that's great. I'm sure loving it. All right, if no one wants to come up, yes, yes, yes. Who's this? I'm sorry, Hilden Haddell. I'm about to close it out for the night. But yeah, if no one has anything wants to come up, I'm gonna go ahead and close it. We'll read this book. How long is this book? Real quick. Let's see how long the book is. Oh my gosh. Just real quick. 279 pages. Not bad. Easy peasy. Well, it doesn't matter the length of the book, I guess, huh? But like, nice. It's a good book. All right. All right. All right, everybody. I wish you all a good night, and I'll see you around.